Hi, welcome back to Into Deep, a podcast with me, Alyssa. In this podcast, we go a little too deep into everything feminism, from the Australian anti-immigration rallies to Femonationalism in the European Union to Incel violence. Jam-packed episode, this one. Just before we go into this episode, I got a new microphone, and I don't know why the hell I was like banging it around for this whole fucking episode. But if you hear all these random microphone noises, that's me just being really aggressive, and that's the sound of my hands. So yeah, I apologize. It's not that bad, but you probably will notice it. Anyway, basically in this episode, we're going to be discussing the co-opting of women's rights and feminist language by the right-wing parties or just non-feminist parties in general for the purpose of pushing forward typically anti-immigration and other general right-wing politics. As we'll see, none of these, nationalistic parties actually care about feminism or women's rights, even though they've begun sort of mentioning it much more often in their kind of political campaigns. It's rather used as a fear-mongering tactic, which also assists in recruiting women into supporting politics that they otherwise would not. So when I first started thinking about this episode, I was just thinking about the rise in anti-immigration ideas and otherwise right-wing politics. And I was thinking about how in August there were anti-immigration rallies across Australia, and actually I was in the Melbourne CBD when one of them was happening, and it was like disgusting. Obviously, these rallies were organised by an organisation called March for Australia, whose goals were to basically end mass migration and also have no foreign flags in the country or something. What the hell, sure. Basically, Beck Freedom, a pseudonym for the organizer of the Sydney March, had said, gang violence, machete violence, rape, home invasion, the list is endless. The people who committed these crimes came here for a better life, but instead they've chosen to treat Australia the same as their former home. Port the third world, become the third world. Beck is a good example of putting a woman at the front of a otherwise conservative political campaign in order to appeal to other women who normally probably wouldn't be interested in this sort of thing. But interestingly enough, I found this quote on a Sydney criminal lawyer's website. I don't know why I was reading this article, but it somehow ended up correlated to other things we're going to talk about. The article was titled "March for Australia Demonstrators Appear to Harbour Racist Sentiment Despite Denials." This article basically gives such big oh my god, racism is bad, guys. Racism is bad vibes. And such as in one quote where they're referring to Beck Freedom. They say, the white Australian woman further insisted that the country's heritage is white, just like the people on the First Fleet, yet the crowd appeared blissfully unaware of the First Nations people of this continent. So, this article was obviously very critical of these marches, very critical of the notion behind them, but also the connections that a lot of the organisers had to real Nazi groups, which is awkward. Also, how the organisation claims that they're for, a better Australia and are not violent, but of course they have all of these very strange connections to white supremacist and Nazi groups. For example, after the march in Melbourne, some protesters attempted to destroy an Indigenous site, injuring 4 people and apparently targeting women first. Oh, who's surprised? So interestingly, in that article, the reason I bring it up is because in her quote where she was talking about how all these immigrants are, doing machete violence and extreme forms of crime, the word rape was hyperlinked. So I clicked on it thinking, oh, they're gonna show us statistics of the race statistics of rape in Australia or something. Well, no. What the page that this took me to was genuinely shocking. So obviously this is a criminal lawyer's website. I wasn't really thinking about that and I clicked this link, but it goes to this page which is basically their defense of sexual offenders. And written on this page is reports of sexual allegations can outrage observers and cause the public and even friends and family members to jump to conclusions despite the questionability of these claims. In our experience, these charges are often brought in the most tenuous of factual circumstances, with police adopting a shoot first and ask questions later attitude far more readily than in many other criminal offences. They have some other bullshit about how being accused of rape or sexual violence is distressing for the person who's accused. Like, okay, no one cares. But under all of this, they have a little like subheading that's like recent success stories. Guys, here are our recent success stories about how we got real rapists to not go to jail. Success, some of which include lawyer granted bail after being charged with choking and multiple counts of sexual assault. First of all, the word is strangulation. Like, I don't think you go to jail for choking on food. Hello. Just under that, a jury found client not guilty of sexual assault despite partial admissions to police. Doctor permitted to continue practicing during proceedings and ultimately found not guilty of sexual assault. I would bet like my life savings, which isn't that much money, on the fact that all of these men are like severely guilty. But the only reason they weren't charged is because they had Sydney's best criminal lawyers. I wasn't even going to start with talking about this, but I just like found it and I thought it was so crazy that they're like publishing, you know, these articles on like, guys, no, the March for Australia, they had connections to Nazis and white supremacists and all these evil men. And then in the same, actually hyperlinked in that article, is a link to them saying how they've got all of these men, these rapist men, like off the hook. Why are you even publishing articles on this? But it's kind of related in the fact that usually, and what we're going to talk about, is that it's often far-right groups or organizations to like pretending to care about violence against women in order to push their anti-immigration like beliefs. Whereas somehow this Sydney lawyer website is pretending to care about like anti-immigration and like you know, right-wing violence and racism, and then they're also like for violence against women, essentially. Basically, I just think this is especially evil in a time when in Australia, violence against women has been named as a national crisis. Also in many other countries, it's basically a pandemic at this point. Many communities of women are especially affected, especially in Australia, particularly Indigenous women and migrant women or refugee women, who also all have the most difficulty seeking help. So it's really interesting that this criminal lawyers website is like, no, like, oh my God, like, we need to be nicer to the immigrants and then help all these men get off charges from probably sexually assaulting immigrants. No, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Oftentimes when violence happens against Indigenous women, migrant women, or refugee women, it's excused under the same anti-immigrant ideas that the reason these women experience violence is because the violence is inherent in their cultures. But again, this isn't even true. Cheryl Moody, who runs the Femicide Watch in Australia, posted in September about two white men who relentlessly attacked a 14-year-old Torres Strait Islander girl in Cairns. If you're outside of Australia, Torres Strait Islanders are an Indigenous group in Australia. When the police arrived, they arrested the young girl as opposed to the two men who were harassing, attacking her and beating her up. The son, by the way, this was a father-son duo who were doing the attacking, was quoted over Snapchat saying, "Dad held her down while I stomped the fuck out of her head." It took at least 2 days for the father-son duo to be arrested, partially only due to the public outrage, thanks to Cheryl Moody posting about it, after they had originally been let go when the police first arrived, right? So you see all these things about like violence against Indigenous women, and it's kind of assumed that this is only happening in Indigenous communities, but it is most definitely happening by white men as well. So there was an article in Pivot by Lizzie Bingham titled "Nationalism, Femicide and New Masculinities, the Far Right's Weaponization of Violence Against Women," published this year, and it was basically talking about some of the cases of violence against women in Australia. One of them was related to the She Matters mural in Hosier Lane in the Melbourne CBD, which is also maintained by Cheryl Moody, which is basically a physical display of all of the women who died as a result of violence, basically since the start of last year, I believe. In May this year, this mural was graffitied with the words "War on Men." As Lizzie Bingham notes, this flagrant disrespect for the mural and the women on it shows a lack of compassion for gendered violence and also demonstrates a worrying attitude. 40% of Australian men under 35 feel that feminism has gone too far, and nearly 20% of Australian men believe that feminism should be violently resisted if necessary. But in the face of mass violence experienced by women, this idea must be challenged if we are to improve women's safety. Another recent incident of large-scale misogynistic violence occurred in the Bondi Junction stabbing last year. The perpetrator in this instance very clearly targeted women, stabbing a total of 14 women and 3 men, with 5 out of 6 of those people who died being women. Bingham writes again, before the perpetrator's identity, white and Australian, was released, there was speculation on social media about the attacker, particularly that they were an Islamic extremist committing an act of terrorism, despite no information to suggest this. Once again, as we're going to get into, when it comes to the word terrorism as well, as we all know, it's pretty much reserved basically for people from Muslim countries. Even though obviously this was also an act of terrorism, the man who did it was a white man. As she writes, at least 2 people were wrongly named as the perpetrator, which spread Islamophobic, anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic rhetoric. After the identity of the killer was released, however, the attack was branded a mental health crisis, and it was claimed that his motivations were not ideological, despite his focus on attacking women. Following the incident as well, his father said that his son was desperate for a girlfriend, which suggests the attack was an act of incel violence. Again, whether this was an act of terror was heavily questioned in the media and online social media, but if his identity had in fact been revealed as a man of Islamic faith, the question of whether it was an act of terror would not even be questioned. It would be obvious. It would be seen as a terrorist act. However, this guy gets revealed as a white man, and then his motivations are certainly not ideological, when clearly he was killing women on purpose. I think there might be an ideology behind that. Obviously, it's not just Australia that is experiencing an uptick in violence against women, particularly incel violence. The United Nations had a study in 2019 titled Global Study on Homicide and Gender-Related Killing of Women and Girls. Even this being 2019, it might be too outdated just because of how much it has increased since then. However, this study basically offers particular insights into the gender-related killing of women and girls. Femicide represents just a small percentage of the overall number of homicides, but in their analysis, it indicates that the drivers of this type of lethal violence require tailored responses. Killings carried out by intimate partners are rarely spontaneous or random and should be examined as an extreme act on a continuum of gender-related violence that remains underreported and too often ignored. As the UN reports, in 2017, around 87,000 women were intentionally killed, with 58% of these being as a result of intimate partner violence or by other family members. This was noted as an increase since the last collection of data in 2012. Even though, obviously, men are the principal victims of homicide globally, women are generally killed as a result of gender stereotypes and inequality, or simply because of their existence as a female or their expected role and status as women, which can differ between cultures as well. As such, the report clusters gender-related killings of women and girls into different forms. Obviously, some forms of violence are more common in specific countries or specific areas. If you look at things like incel violence, obviously that's a heavily Americanized form of misogynistic violence. Basically, by clustering these killings, they could describe the most common or recognizable forms of femicide globally. These include femicide as a result of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, honor-related killings, dowry-related killings, killings of women in armed conflict, killings of Aboriginal and Indigenous women, extreme forms of violent killings, such as those occurring in organised crime or drug trafficking, killing as a result of sexual orientation, killing due to accusations of sorcery and witchcraft, and also the killing of female prostitutes or sex workers. As I said, obviously these types of killings can occur on global, regional or national scales, but many of these crimes do lack data because they go unreported, either because it's in rural areas, because the police force don't care about violence against women, or because some forms of violence are to some point like expected or almost allowed against the women they occur against, such as with honor or dowry related killings. Honor killings, which is a practice encountered in parts of Asia and oftentimes in rural areas. Dowry-related killings similarly occur mostly in South Asian countries and either go unreported or the reason behind a woman's death is often covered up. For example, oftentimes the woman is burnt to death and the excuse for this will be like accidental fires. In India, this has resulted in a unique penal code which applies to unnatural deaths of a woman within 7 years of her marriage. In regards to organized crime, again, there is not much known about the rates and how these occur because of the illegality of the context already. In some parts of the world, such as in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, women are still killed due to allegations of witchcraft, which often increases as a woman reaches old age. In Papua New Guinea, for example, all ethnic groups have a system of beliefs that account for the existence of sorcery. Oftentimes, these killings are also associated with highly patriarchal cultures, as I said, where it happens a lot more often to older women because they start having to rely on their sons or other male family members to support them. Importantly, also a very obvious group that is often targeted by gendered violence is sex workers or prostitutes. They have the highest homicide victimization rate of any set of women ever studied. This report also notes that due to attitudes of possessiveness and male superiority, particularly expressed by clients, is one of the main reasons that the killings against prostitutes happen so much more commonly than other women. The majority of prostitution, even in areas where it is legal, still occurs in highly criminal environments as well. Similarly to like killings in organized crimes, oftentimes there's not a lot of data on it because it goes underreported and people simply just don't care. Some men also find it easier to rationalize violence against sex workers. One, because they're less likely to be found out, and two, because they view sex workers as even less human than other women. When the killings of a sex worker are reported in media, victim blaming is also very common, as these women are seen as low class and in some way deserving it because of the sort of like activities they partake in, when realistically most women who turn to sex work or prostitution only do it because they have no other option. With the increasing rate of femicide globally, along with the fact that it occurs more commonly in the third world, many political parties are being urged to create policies. However, in political systems that are typically made up of high proportions of men, especially in countries in the third world, oftentimes they don't really care that much about women. In saying that, most centrist and left parties do attempt to put some change forward, even if it's not that effective. And especially this occurs in nations with higher participation of women in the workforce and by extension in political systems. Alongside this, there are many right-wing political groups who have been putting the protection of women, the idea that we have to protect the women in the state, at the forefront of their campaigns, oftentimes alongside otherwise misogynistic policies, especially surrounding reproductive rights, laws around abortion, traditional families and marriage, and also just gender roles in general. In the context of femicide rates, it's important for women to not fall for these right-wing lies. And that's basically the main point of this, that I'll be discussing why the right has begun hijacking feminism for their own sake and why feminists definitely should not be falling for this. A pretty good example of the recent hijacking of a femicide case to push forward people's own political agendas was with the death of Irina Zaritska in North Carolina. Obviously, I don't want to talk too much about this because it's just a horrific thing that happened, and I never want to make content out of like a woman's death, but rather what I want to talk about is the fact that this case of femicide was essentially co-opted by right-wing groups, especially a lot of right-wing politicians and other, public figures on like Twitter especially, who were basically using this as an opportunity to further their political agenda. The problem with this was not at all with the condemnation of the act that occurred, obviously, that man needs to be like shot in the head 1,000 times, but rather that it was from the same kind of people who set up a culture that allows for things like this to happen, the same kind of people who would never otherwise care about instances of violence against women, except for the fact that it was by a black man. As such, it's not just immigrants that are used as basically examples to push forward political agenda, it's anyone who isn't white. Basically, the best way to refer to this kind of hijacking or exploitation of women's rights, feminism, femicide, feminist language by right-wing parties is the concept of Femonationalism. So in 2017, in her book, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism, British sociologist Sarah Farris coined the term femonationalism. How many times am I going to say that? Which refers to the mobilization of feminist themes by nationalist parties within anti-immigration campaigns. Because this book focuses mostly on the rise of femonationalism in European political groups, particularly in the Netherlands, France, and Italy, the theory is mainly again about European nationalist parties, which began to promote historically uncharacteristic ideas about gender equality amongst, again, an otherwise very misogynistic, very conservative political leaning, xenophobia, but particularly that of anti-Islam. Across these parties, there was a reoccurring theme of being anti-immigration, highly particularly in regards to Muslim men, of course, in the name of supposed women's rights. I'm definitely not going to sit here and defend Islam or any religion for that matter. If you know me, you know I fucking hate religion. All religions function effectively to oppress women into gender roles in one way or another, to obviously different levels of extreme, which is an idea that we will come back to as well. And also, I am in no way a cultural relativist. Dude, when I was graduating from my degree, I had like one semester left because I hadn't done enough units to graduate. So I did this like philosophy unit. When we were doing cultural relativism, I was just pissed off the whole time. Like, that is genuinely the worst like philosophical theory ever. Cultural relativism, like, no, okay? I hate that shit. And also, like, life as a woman for me is obviously very much easier than it is for any woman in the third world, and it would be stupid for me to pretend that nations that have religion or other cultural backgrounds sort of built into them are very often more misogynistic and patriarchal. Like, it would be stupid for me to pretend that that's not true. However, misogyny still exists even in the best of countries, and I think the best way that we can help sometimes is not by like just talking about how much we hate other countries, but rather by pushing forward feminism out in our own spaces, because oftentimes from across the world there isn't really much that we can do. My hope is always that, like, by pushing forward feminism in countries, countries that are considered the best countries for women, like Australia, that will kind of have a flow down effect to other countries that are not as well off. Of course, mainly in regards to nationalist parties. Farris writes, some scholars have described the nationalists' turn to themes of women's equality as an attempt to modernize their agenda and increase their female constituencies. Others have drawn a link between Europe and the United States, where conservative politicians framed post-9/11 imperialist wars in the Middle East as missions to liberate Muslim women from Muslim men. But it's important to note, and Farris does as well, it's not just right-wing parties that are peddling anti-immigration ideas in the name of feminism. In this episode, of course, the main group that I will be talking about is the right-wing parties and how they're kind of co-opting these feminist ideas. But I want to do a quick side note on feminist groups that have singled out Islam and immigrants as especially patriarchal, which, to be honest, they are. But here's the thing. I don't believe religion has any place in radical feminism at all, obviously. But unfortunately, there are some feminists that become so deeply focused on a very specific part of feminism, such as a very particular liberation from religious oppression or being gender critical, for an example, that they abandon all other core ideas, or they abandon other really important parts of feminism to become hyper-focused on this one goal and reach this one specific part. Some good examples recently are feminists who got to the point that they hated the Islamic religion so much because, again, they became hyper-focused on it being the biggest patriarchal evil, that they supported Israel over what they believed is the terrorist organization Hamas. In doing so, forgetting that most of the people who are being slaughtered in Palestine are probably women and children. Or another good example is the supposed feminists who are so gender critical, who are so anti-trans or whatever, that they're posting, rest in peace posts for Charlie Kirk. for Charlie Kirk because they, believed, or they supported him in one of his beliefs, which was against gender ideology, that they're, thinking that he was some person that agreed with them in any way. Like, he hates you. Like, he hated you. He was not on your side, and I will discuss more about this in when I'm talking about US politics as well. Going back to Israel for a second, and I guess these feminists who again have become so anti-Islam, so anti-Arab countries that they start supporting Israel instead is fucking crazy. In fact, there was an article published recently by like the Jerusalem Post. Like, I didn't really want to use this like a resource, but it's kind of important. It was posted just last week, actually, about the massive increase in inter-Israeli rape, and particularly child rape, since the beginning of the Gaza genocide. Basically, the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel received over 50,000 queries in 2024, but they were unable to provide a full annual report as they normally would because government ministries, including the Israeli police, the IDF, alongside prison, education, and welfare ministries, all withheld key information about sexual violence rates in Israel. The majority of the reports that were collected, though, included minors, and there was a steep increase in sexual violence in schools, youth workplaces, and treatment settings as well. So obviously, as we know, rape and sexual violence are almost integral parts of the IDF and how they use them against Palestinian people. In a report by the UN early this year, Navi Pillay, chair of the commission, said, "The evidence collected by the commission reveals a deplorable increase in sexual and gender-based violence. There is no escape from the conclusion that Israel has employed sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians to terrorize them and perpetuate a system of oppression that undermines their right to self-determination." Sexual violence has obviously increased in severity and frequency against Palestinian people during the genocide, and it's used as a strategy of war by Israel to, dominate and destroy the Palestinian people. The article also notes that there's specific forms of sexual violence that are basically standard operating procedures towards Palestinian people by the IDF. This shows that Israel is a state built on dominance, and this expression, of course, in violence against women, but not only as a form of extreme warfare and extermination against the Palestinian people, but of their own people too. Because it is unsurprising to me that a state that is built on using rape as a form of terrorism and warfare against another group of people also has increasing rape rates in their own country. As this article also notes by the UN, the systemic rape of women in armed conflict is oftentimes also used to destroy the fabric of societies, as women who have suffered conflict rape are often shunned and ostracized by their own communities, particularly in cultures that, focus on the concept of honor. It's kind of reminiscent of Japanese comfort women who, when they returned back to their communities, they kind of were seen as dishonorable because of what they were forced to partake in. But I think this again just comes back to the idea of femonationalism and how it essentially is built on the idea that all Arab people are rapists. Not even all Arab people, just fucking everyone who isn't white is like a scary rapist. And refuses to acknowledge that the usually white people of their own country are just as capable and do commit sexual violence against their own women too. This also correlates to the idea of ownership, of course. White men and political parties who pretend to care about sexual violence against women, but only do so when it occurs against their own women, i.e. the women they own via marriage or family as property. This is also why people often tell men to imagine if this was your daughter or wife or sister who was experiencing sexual violence to get them to see why it's bad. It's not about, care. It's actually about ownership, the ownership of women through family or marriage. Obviously, forms of femonationalism and different forms of femicide were occurring across Europe. In an article by Alexandra Staudinger titled "Moving from Victim Blaming and Racialization to a Diversified Transnational Response to Gendered Violence in Austria," she writes that the reception of femicides in Austria by the mainstream media when the perpetrator is a white Austrian is traditionally focused on victim blaming and the romanticization of intimate partner violence. For example, there was a 2019 femicide case where a woman rejected the advances of some man and he later killed her. Basically, the official state news website reported that the reason that the murder victim was killed was because she declined the offer by this man. This is again indicative of the victim blaming that permeates reports of gendered violence in Austria, but obviously across the world. The female victim is implicitly blamed for his crime, for not complying with the perpetrator's wishes, or for refusing him. I kind of see like this form of victim blaming that occurs as almost the real way that conservatives actually see sexual violence, as being, you know, either a woman's fault or being like, you know, a man's right to take from a woman. On the other hand, when the perpetrator is a foreign man, conservatives use the same crime as an excuse for anti-immigrant, nationalistic, and overall right-wing ideas. As Staudinger writes, the public discourse is less concerned with women's safety, let alone their self-determination, than it is with neo-fascist notions of ethnic purity and xenophobia. There was also another article in The Nation by Edna Bonhomme titled The Disturbing Rise of Femonationalism. She writes, challenging femonationalism is not just a question of moral posturing. Rather, it will mean highlighting the ways in which anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric, whether implied or explicit, have provided confidence to the far right. Whether you agree with Islam or not doesn't matter, because it's essentially used as fodder to push forward racist and far-right policies, which not only make life worse for migrant women, of course, but it also puts feminism on the back burner. Feminism in, you know, Western countries. It puts that on the back burner as these right-wing politicians focus instead on migrant men and migrant women. Researcher Stephanie Boulila referred to this as a liberal smokescreen, which both refutes multiculturalism and blocks any further feminist progress which seeks to benefit all women. In another article about femonationalism in Europe by Viola Dombrovsky titled Far-Right Feminists, the Exploitation of Women's Rights and What's Behind It, published in the Progressive Post. She writes, in this narrative, an overarching juxtaposition between a civilized, enlightened, and egalitarian Europe and a racialized, inherently backward, and misogynistic Islam or broader global South is created. The far right portrays them as carriers of patriarchal violence and values, threatening the long-won rights and liberties of women in the countries that welcome them. In this sense, regions like Europe, America, and Australia often portray themselves as nations that have always welcomed women's rights, and in fact have achieved true equality for women and men, to the point that accepting immigration poses a risk in completely destroying almost the foundation of these states. Obviously, the only reason women have rights in countries like Australia, America, and European countries is because they fought for them. You know, it wasn't actually a foundation of these countries that women always had rights like they pretend is true. Simultaneously, in Australia and in the Americas, it wasn't long ago that Indigenous people, including women, were still being slaughtered and forced into sexual slavery at the hands of colonialist power. How are you going to build a country on colonialism and then claim that women's rights was something that was always integral to the country from the start? And, you know, immigration in that sense poses a risk of destroying almost the fabric of our being as a national community. Even still now, Indigenous women experience more violence as a consequence of this brutal colonization. Also, the idea that women of color must be liberated from their male counterparts, while true, of course, is often not really what these parties care about or focus on. For example, and what we're going to discuss next, how the American wars in the Middle East supposedly, you know, tried to liberate women, but only really made their lives worse in the process. Yes, that's right. So we're going to be talking about the war on terror. While the concept of femonationalism in Faris's book is in relation to mostly anti-Islam politics because of its European context, the theory can obviously be applied to politics globally, particularly looking at the war on terror in Afghanistan and both of Donald Trump's presidential terms. As much as these political parties put a huge focus on the protection of our own women, or, you know, the women that are owned by the country, basically really only caring about how these dangerous immigrant men keep attacking Western women. Again, the idea of ownership. There is also the idea that Muslim women need to be forcibly liberated. This is one of the main reasons behind the war on terror, or, you know, one of the reasons that was pretended to be a reason behind the war on terror. Basically liberating these innocent, weak and incapable, almost childlike women from their innately aggressively oppressive male population. I've quoted previously on this podcast, one of my favorite modern feminist texts is The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. She writes, soon after her husband inaugurated the war on terror by invading Afghanistan, Laura Bush explained that the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. She did not mention the historical role of the US in making Afghanistan one of the world's worst places to be a woman. The liberation of women, always a good thing, of course, in circumstances such as these, is often gone about in a completely incorrect way, and it tends to just disenfranchise third world women who are seen as incompetent and needing to be rescued, but that rescue never comes. It also kind of like ignores the idea that women in these countries have their own feminist movements as well, and these feminist movements need to be supported, not kind of just like invaded by other countries and trying to be fixed in ways that just simply don't work. As such, Afghanistan is still one of the worst places to be a woman, which is the title of an article by Lauren Bone published in Time in 2018. The author discusses how the economic devastation left after the United States' longest war and how this left Afghan women more hopeless than ever. Since the publishing of this article, obviously the situation has become even worse. Already 90% of Afghan women had experienced domestic violence, with 80% of suicides being by women. Even at the time of writing in 2018, 2 out of 3 of Afghan girls did not attend school, 87% of Afghan women were illiterate, and 70 to 80% faced forced marriage. The article talks about as well how a watchdog report called the USAID's $280 million Promote program, billed the largest single investment that the US government has ever made to advance women's rights globally, a flop and a waste of taxpayers' money. This article was published before the Taliban regained control in Afghanistan in 2021, following the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces and the fall of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Almost $2 trillion later, the country is in just as bad, if not worse, shape than when the US first intervened. It's almost as if the US never really cared about the women in the first place. It's almost as if they kind of went in and just tried to kill everyone. Even in the case of this same sort of thing happening, where, again, as I said, other countries sort of invade into third world countries to attempt to improve the lives of women, oftentimes, again, they don't really know what they're going into. Like, they don't know the best way to help these women in these countries. As well, this author writes, the history of US feminism, which for some time has been the most globally powerful form of feminism, is a history of some women wielding to great effect state power and ultimately supranational power. But it is also a history of the capitalist state channeling the power of women in ways that are conducive to its own sustenance, ways ultimately that do little to threaten the ruling class. Decades of attempting to improve the conditions of third world women are paled by the fact that those associated never cared enough to ask what these women actually needed. Pouring money into legal rights, tertiary education, and gender equality do little for the women who don't have access to food, transportation, or shelter, essentially. Now, in discussing anti-immigration politics, I would be crazy for not including Donald Trump, of course. Donald Trump has a history of scapegoating immigrants, not just during his presidential terms. Another quote I have mentioned in a previous episode from Shrinivasan's book, she writes, in 1989, he took out full-size ads in 4 New York City newspapers calling for the execution of the 5 teenage boys, 4 black and 1 Latino, falsely accused of raping a woman in Central Park. These ads, while distinctively Trumpian in their bombast and orgiastic celebration of state violence, also serve as a reminder that Trump's politics were formed in the context of a broader history of US carceralism. During Trump's first presidential term, as I'm sure we can all remember, do you guys remember where you were when he got elected? Was built on building a wall to stop illegal immigration and also especially cruel treatment of those who did illegally immigrate. During his presidential announcement speech, Trump claimed that there was a, quote, mind-boggling link between illegal immigrants and rape rates. Actually, the article he was referring to had said that over 80% of women who cross the Mexican border are likely to be raped in the process, often by criminal gangs, traffickers, or corrupt officials. Obviously, when this fact was pointed out to him, he didn't care. In 2018, again, he mentioned a similar statistic about how women from Central America are raped at, quote, levels that nobody has ever seen before. which was somehow an argument to strengthen US immigration laws and not, kind of try and help these women who are supposedly being raped at, quote, levels that nobody has ever seen before. This was also during the time where a group of activists had essentially set up a caravan to take people seeking asylum to the US border. And women particularly were choosing to travel with this caravan partly because of concerns about violence and assault if they were to take the normal route through the sort of people who try and help people across the border. A senior associate of a human rights group in Latin America said it really made absolutely no sense to use this narrative that migrants who are coming because of violence are violent themselves, and say that's why we need to close our border. A woman who's endured sexual abuse should not be turned away at the border. She's in need of health and medical attention. Again, because Trump doesn't actually care what happens to these women. He cares about the fact that he can use it to push forward his anti-immigrant political agenda. In that same article that I mentioned earlier by Lizzie Bingham, she wrote about how this year Trump signed in the Riley Act, requiring the mandatory detention of undocumented immigrants who have been charged with certain crimes, including low-level crimes such as theft or burglary. They do not have to be convicted to be detained, nor do they have the right to apply for bail at all. Yet somehow, though this violates the US Constitution, the right to due process that anyone in the US has, whether they're a citizen or not, his supporters that, seem to care so much about the Constitution didn't really care about this part that went against their constitutional rights. The act was named after American student Laken Riley, who died at the hands of an undocumented Venezuelan immigrant, reminiscent of the Latino rapists that Trump had warned about in his first term. Conveniently, through the whole time where he's talking about how much all the Latinos and all the immigrants are raping all of these women, he forgets to mention the at least 28 women who have accused him of various acts of sexual misconduct, his still also mostly under wraps relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, or his role in freeing Andrew and Tristan Tate and bringing them both back to the US. Obviously men who have allegations, but we all know they're true, of trafficking women and sexual violence and all of these other insane things. The author of this article, Lizzie Bingham, also mentions uniquely American homegrown acts of women hatred. Women in sororities being 74% more likely to be assaulted than any other women in college, likely at the hands of their fraternity counterparts. Or the almost 400 Southern Baptist church leaders who have pleaded guilty or been convicted of sex crimes since 1998. Most of these perpetrators obviously being white Christian men. Leading on from that, I found a really interesting article and I guess a good case study about homegrown violence perpetrated by the same individuals who would support far-right politics and likely voted for Donald Trump. It discusses the misogynistic narrative shared by some North American incel violent extremists. The article was published in Terrorism and Political Violence, titled "Because They Are Women in a Man's World, a critical discourse analysis of incel violent extremists and the stories they tell." Basically, the findings of this study were that incel men expect women to provide feminine coded services while men are entitled to assume masculine coded privileges. The article mentions how much of the research on incels treats them as anomalous or pathologizes their beliefs as mental health issues, despite the awareness of links between structural misogyny and terrorist-style violence, alongside the wider and unique existence of patriarchy in Western cultures. I say unique because, depending on the place, most Western societies are not actually supported by a culturally entwined religion, or in that sense, nor do they have a reason or need, I suppose, for having a gendered social structure. They don't have like some, sort of like foundation to their society built into religion or like some other belief system that is kind of used as an excuse for why women are treated the way they are. US, for example, I mean, obviously it has a very Christian history, but not many people actually believe in and follow Christianity, even if they say they do. Therefore, there's not really like an excuse for how the patriarchy and misogyny that still prevails, besides a lack of desire for change. In this study, they explored misogyny as a concept that is basically the reality and product of social environments in which women are excluded or positioned in a way that consistently sees us failing to live up to expected norms, even if these have no like reason behind them. In an article by Gentry titled Misogynistic Terrorism, It Has Always Been There, the author notes that studies surrounding terrorism often do not delve into the consistently underpinning element of misogyny. As we already talked about, terrorism is kind of seen as a uniquely Islamic extremist sort of thing. And that is because under a patriarchy, quote, misogyny and violence against women is not political and therefore is not terrorism. This links back to incel violence as well, which isn't taken seriously and again is seen as an anomaly because it's almost normal, if that makes sense. Essentially in the sense of like other forms of terrorism, they're seen as illegitimate in society, such as that of Islamic religion or actually, that's basically the only one. Misogyny is a highly legitimized belief in society. So it normalizes this behavior as kind of just another iteration of expected misogyny in our social systems. As we know, incels have an obsession with women not playing the role that we're supposed to. Basically not supplying those, feminized acts of service, but especially in not supplying sex to men. Erin Willihan writes that the link between sexual frustration and violence is a symptom of misogynistic and oppressive cultural values that mask the problematic societal forces that engender sexual frustration and its violent expressions within the incel community. This very sort of like Americanized misogyny cultural setting is what even puts an importance on sex anyway, and particularly in its role in ensuring a male's dominance and a female's submission. It kind of, especially in America and other Western cultures, there's such a focus on being like sexually capable, I suppose, and also not having sex being really demonized. So Willihan writes, rather than questioning why men feel entitled to sex in the first place, this blue balls theory of terrorism obscures the very problem by erasing its gendered and racial aspects. As she points out too, if the real reason behind, incel mass violence was sexual frustration, women would be doing it a lot more than men. So it's interesting, again, that incels blame sort of women for their lack of sex, basically, when realistically it wouldn't even be something that they would be like bullied for or like treated worse for not doing, if not for the like highly misogynistic Americanized culture, which allows for that to happen. Incel-related terrorism, as I said, is just an iteration, and I wouldn't even call it an extreme iteration, of the American ideology which is built on the supremacy of the white man and his dominance. To even consider misogyny as an extreme ideology is laughable. It's basically the fabric of society itself. That is the expectation of a man in the same way that being in the kitchen is the expectation of a woman. In an honors thesis by a Bucknell University student, Lauren Zielkowski, she explores how the gendered violence being enacted by so-called incels has existed long before Reddit and the manosphere, but that there were iterations of a similar sort of concept among the libertines of the Restoration period of the mid-1600s. In both cases, male privilege was threatened by social progression, particularly for women of the time. And the misogyny in our societies has persisted over time, obviously, allowing for these extreme acts of violence against women to persist too, but also allowing for this kind of archetype of man who becomes so threatened by women's social progression that he becomes an extremist in his misogynistic thinking. Even though self-identified incels or misogynistic men are obviously a mixed race of every race group, there is still white supremacy implicit in their belief system, again because of the Americanized background of incels. But as I mentioned again, it's not built on the excuse of religion or honor or history or like family, whatever. It's built on the American male's need for power. White men commit mass shootings more than any other group, yet we don't see right-wing parties pushing to re-educate young white boys away from gun violence, white supremacy, and misogyny, as we do, right-wing parties pushing to stop any racialized man from entering the country. Even the US Department of State counterterrorism strategies are essentially all focused on counteracting Muslim extremism and refuse to acknowledge domestic forms of violence induced by their own culture. In fact, the Obama-era Department of Homeland Security rejected including violent misogyny online and violence against women in real life as terrorism, as they supposedly did not rise to the level of violent extremism that they aimed to tackle. Basically, like, this all kind of just links back to all of the ideas that I've discussed. It's an extremely difficult concept that has so many different views to it, obviously. I mean, as I've said, like, there's no world in which I would defend any sort of religion, but in that same sense, I also don't think that women should be turning to these right-wing parties as in any way being supportive of women's rights at all. It's always a liberal smokescreen, as I said. It's always just a lie to try and recruit women to their side. Essentially, why I made this episode was because it's crucial for us to look beyond our own biases and also see that there's not always one clear answer for something. Right-wing anti-immigration tactics nor cultural relativism are the way to go. So it's important, especially for us as feminists and allies, to not fall for either of these options and kind of seek something which is apart from both of these. Yeah, it's kind of something that just doesn't have like one simple answer. There's so many different parts of it. But I hope I was able to explain some of that. I don't know why I was talking really fast in this episode. Like, I thought I was swimming for like an hour and a half and it's only been an hour. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, I feel like I didn't really give a real answer at the end of this episode just because I don't really think there is one. But I would be interested to hear your thoughts if you want to leave a comment. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review if you're listening on Spotify, because guys, I feel like I'm being review bombed. Actually, only leave me a review if you're going to give me 5 stars. Don't leave me one if you're not going to give me 5. Anyway, as I said, I'd be really interested to have some of your guys' ideas in the comments because I seriously don't have an answer here. Thank you so much for listening, and I will maybe have another episode out, but it is Christmas retail season, so we'll see if that kills me or not. Okay, bye guys, have a good week.